Hello, we'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Upholding Professional Standards. Hello, we'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Upholding Professional Standards in the Regulation of ABA Practitioners, hosted by the New Jersey Association for Behavior Analysis and presented by Dr. Gina Green, CEO of the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts. I'm Suzanne Buchanan, Government Affairs Chair for NJABA and the Executive Director for Autism New Jersey. And I'm joined by my colleague, Eric Eberman, the Public Policy Director for Autism New Jersey. As I mentioned at the beginning of our last webinar last week, the NJABA Board has been monitoring the regulation of the practice for more than 10 years. During this time, Dr. Green has been an invaluable resource of expertise, caution, and motivation at all the right times. And we're thrilled that she can present this webinar to you today. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin the presentation. The first one is about CEUs. So NJABA is not set up to verify attendance, so we are not offering what are called Type 2 CEUs. However, you may wish to look into Type 3 CEUs on the BACB's website because this webinar would likely qualify. Again, please look into Type 3 CEUs. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. The second item is questions about the content during today's webinar. So feel free during the webinar to submit questions through the webinar format, and we will reserve time at the end to review and share your questions with Gina and hopefully get all of them answered. If we don't have time to get them all answered or you have a follow-up question after the end of the webinar, please email us at governmentaffairs@njaba.org. Again, that's governmentaffairs@njaba.org. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gina Green.
Thank you, Suzanne, for that great introduction, and thank you all for participating. I understand that a lot of you were involved in the last webinar. Some of the information that I'll present today will be a little bit of a review and reiteration of information from the first webinar, but a lot of it will be different, and I think the context is going to be a little bit broader in that the topic is professional standards, including ethical standards, and how those come to play and should be applied to the regulation of our practice. So I'm going to say a little bit about APBA just quickly, and then very briefly discuss the most common forms of professional regulation. And then I want to go into some detail about what makes for a legitimate and valid professional credentialing program, generally speaking. I'll then get into some of the provisions of the BACB's compliance code for behavior analysts that are directly applicable to the regulation of ABA practitioners, and review our position on regulation and get into some detail on the rationale for making BACB certifications the main foundation for government credentials, state-issued credentials such as licenses. Give a brief summary, and then we'll, I hope, have plenty of time for questions and answers. So for those of you who don't know, APBA, the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts, was founded almost 10 years ago now as a nonprofit membership organization that is focused entirely on the practice of applied behavior analysis. And our mission is multifaceted, but a major component of that is advocating for public policies to protect and advance the science-based practice of ABA. That includes laws such as those that govern funding, the autism insurance laws, Medicaid rules, and so on. And then laws and regulations around who can practice ABA and how, such as licensure laws. So we have worked on at least 25 of the 29 licensure laws that have been adopted so far. Some number of other bills to licensed behavior analysts that have been filed in other states, and that includes several that are active right now, and some that we expect will be filed in the near future. I mentioned APBA as a membership organization. We do have memberships for people in various categories, very reasonable annual dues. We don't have chapters because chapter implies a subservient relationship to the parent organization. Instead, we have affiliates, which are behavior analysis organizations at the state and regional level, like NJABA, and other scholarly and scientific organizations. We're coming up on our 8th annual convention. It will be a scant less than a month from now in the great American city of St. Louis. So we'd love to see all of you there. So let me just briefly talk about the most common types of professional regulation or credentialing programs. There is certification in many professions, and I hope most of you are well aware of certification in our field. Certification programs generally are managed by independent, nonprofit, national or international organizations. In some fields, those are professional organizations. Very often they're truly independent nonprofits like the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. Certification is generally voluntary. It's up to each individual professional as to whether they obtain the certification. However, there could be laws that specify that in order to qualify for a particular position or funding stream, you have to hold a national certification. Importantly, the requirements for obtaining certifications, good ones, valid ones, come from the profession, and I'll talk a little bit more about exactly how that is done. And certifications are portable across geographic boundaries. So if you're a board certified behavior analyst in New Jersey, you're a board certified behavior analyst anywhere. And that's important because of a contrast with the other common, or one of the other common forms of regulation, which of course is licensure. Licensure is not voluntary, it's mandated. By definition, there's a law adopted in each jurisdiction, such as a state or province, that requires one to hold a license issued by the government, by that state, for example, in order to call yourself by a certain title or to practice the profession. Most licensure laws cover both of those protections. They're called Title Acts and Practice Acts. So they specify that you have to have the license to use a particular title and to practice the profession, unless you're in some carefully proscribed exempt categories. With licensure, the requirements for obtaining the license and the oversight of the practice of people who hold the licenses comes from the legislature, because they're the ones that are going to adopt the licensure statute and determine any requirements that are included there. The government agency, licensure programs have to live somewhere within a state's structure. So there's typically a department or an agency of some kind that may oversee many different licensing programs. And then very often, but not always, there is a regulatory body such as a licensing board for that particular profession. And so that instead of that nonprofit independent certification entity, we now have various entities within the state that are going to determine who is issued a license and who can practice and how they practice. Unfortunately, that nice portability across boundaries that you have with certification isn't guaranteed with licensure. By definition, here in the US, these laws, licensure laws, are state by state. And that means that the requirements can vary somewhat from state to state. They could vary a lot from one state to the other. And so reciprocity isn't guaranteed, meaning if you're licensed in one state, you move to another, or you want to work in another state, you may or may not readily qualify for licensure in that second location. And that's true of virtually all professions. So let me go into a little bit of information about what makes for valid and legitimate professional credentialing programs. I should have disclosed at the outset here that I did serve on the Behavior Analyst Certification Board back in 2000 to 2006. I am not on that board now. We do work pretty closely with the BACB, but I learned a lot about this whole area of professional credentialing in those 6 years on the BACB, and obviously even more since then as I've worked on licensure laws. So one of the things I've learned is that legitimate professional credentialing programs, we're talking either certification or licensure or some combination thereof, have certain things in common. There are very well established standards from case law on professional credentialing and from the world of psychometrics, testing and examinations. So good credentialing programs determine the competencies, or what are sometimes called the knowledge, skills, and abilities involved in practicing the profession, and the content of their examinations through job analysis studies, or they're sometimes called occupational analysis studies. I'll say a little bit more about those in a minute. There are also standards and procedures well established for determining the eligibility requirements. What do you have to qualify for the credential? And those typically are in the form of one or more degrees, a certain coursework, and certain practical training in the credential profession. And then there is virtually always in these sound programs a requirement that those who are eligible get to take a valid and reliable objective examination in the subject matter. And that's really crucial for a lot of reasons, one of them being that it's important for the programs to be able to defend themselves in court. If they're challenged by someone who doesn't earn the credential, or someone to whom they've issued a credential misbehaves, the credentialing program, the body that issues the credential, has to be able to show that they have objective and empirical basis for making the determinations as to who gets a credential and how those people conduct themselves. These programs also have continuing professional development requirements, continuing education generally, and ethical and disciplinary standards. The extent to which a certification body can enforce disciplinary standards tends to vary. As you guys probably know, the BACB originally had a code of ethics specific to the practice of behavior analysis that really constituted just guidelines. They were not fully enforced. And then they had a small set of disciplinary standards that the BACB could enforce. Now, as of 2016, the BACB compliance code is fully enforced, but the BACB can enforce that code only with people to whom it issues credentials. There's very little the BACB can do about people who claim to be qualified to practice behavior analysis, but they're not certified or otherwise credentialed by the BACB. So just to contrast with those sort of basic features of sound credentialing programs, I want to run through some other kinds of so-called credentialing programs, mainly because we are finding as states consider adopting laws to license behavior analysts or otherwise regulate them, that there's pressure, sometimes pretty forceful, sometimes not, but there are elements that will say, well, we shouldn't limit licensure of behavior analysts to only people who hold a certain set of credentials. We should open it up to people who have various other kinds of credentials or something indicating perhaps that they had some training in behavior analysis. So I want to just, again, describe some of the kinds of credentials that people often, I would say, get confused with legitimate professional credentials like those I just described. So for example, you probably know that there are lots of entities out there, they're mostly for-profit companies, that will give you something called a certification or some kind of credential if you just pay them money and perhaps, you know, participate in some kind of online modules or something like that. They just do not have even remotely the features of a legitimate professional credentialing program. There are also some certifications out there whose requirements aren't derived from these job analysis studies that are done by the legitimate kinds of professional credentialing programs. The requirements are set by some small number of people. It's often really unclear where those requirements came from. Sometimes some of these entities will say that they've done a job analysis study, but those studies aren't published. It's impossible to find out, at least in my experience, exactly how they were conducted. Did they comply with, again, psychometric standards and requirements for doing a proper job analysis study? There are also entities that will offer a certification in a specific intervention model. So, you know, social skills training for people with autism with a certain brand name. Those certifications are typically offered by the developers or the promoters of those particular intervention models, or it may be an assessment instrument or you know, a curriculum, something like that. The content is typically limited, so to get a certification in that particular model or assessment, you only presumably have to know something about that model. The competencies, if there are any, there often are not specified competencies, are again limited, and you don't have to have a lot of training. There is no professional exam. These are not credentials for practicing a profession. They're some way to signify that someone has had some amount of exposure to information, again, about a specific intervention technique or test or curriculum or something like that. And, you know, of course, there's no code of ethics. Again, these are not professional credentials. There are also some certifications around that purport to indicate that someone is qualified to provide intervention to a particular client population, such as children with autism. Again, contrast that with professional credentials, legitimate ones, to practice a profession. Actual certifications in professions, like state-issued licenses in professions, are typically not specific to any particular client population or setting or anything like that. And again, if one obtains a certification to, let's say, engage in some kind of intervention with people with autism, it's obviously going to be, again, a limited set of methods and concepts and content that's covered. It doesn't cover the profession, broadly speaking. And then something we find that people are often and understandably confused about is what are called certificates or certificate programs. that are operated by universities. Universities, many like to be able to hand people a certificate that typically signifies only that they've completed some courses in some content area. Again, this is not a professional certification. It's not a credential to practice the profession. There's no exam. There may be exams in the courses, but no general professional credentialing exam. So it doesn't have the features that we just reviewed. But it is confusing, and we have sometimes had, as states have considered licensure for behavior analysts, said, well, why don't we give licenses to people who've completed these university certificate programs or one of these alternative kinds of certifications? So just something to watch out for as you consider form of regulation for your state. I want to jump now to talk just a little bit about some of the elements, provisions of the BACB compliance code that, in my opinion, are highly applicable to this whole context of regulation of our profession. The BACB compliance code is the code of ethics specific to behavior analysts. Technically, it applies only to people who are credentialed by the BACB. But it does, of course, provide, again, the broad general ethical framework for the practice of behavior analysis. So some of the provisions that I think are really germane to this whole area of regulation of our practice are these. 6.0 says behavior analysts have an obligation to the science of behavior and the profession of behavior analysis. There's hardly anything that is going to have a greater impact on our profession than laws that determine who can call themselves a behavior analyst and who can practice behavior analysis professionally. So I think, and we have an ethical responsibility to the profession in this very important context of regulation. A corollary of that provision of the code is that we affirm our principles, that we give the values, ethics, and principles of our profession precedence, that we keep those among others at the forefront in everything we do. Certainly, if we're working on laws and regulations governing practice, this should apply. We also have an ethical obligation to participate in professional and scientific organizations or activities. Again, there's hardly an activity I can think of that's more important than efforts to get laws and regulations adopted that govern how we practice. We, of course, have a responsibility ethically to rely on professionally derived knowledge when making scientific decisions, when making clinical decisions, or engaging in professional endeavors. And I would argue that, again, advocating for laws and regulations around our practice is an extremely important professional endeavor. We, of course, have a provision that we behave with integrity, meaning consistently in line with the values and principles of the field. One of the sub provisions of that one is that our behavior conforms to the legal and ethical codes of the social and professional community of which we're members. As a young profession, we are behind a number of others when it comes to laws and rules and regulations that govern what we do and where the funding comes from, but we're rapidly catching up. So it's simply inevitable, and we are at the point in our profession where there will be increasing pressure to regulate the practice through government. And again, I think there's no more important arena than that one. So we need to be cognizant and work to make sure that our code of ethics is, and our standards and values are reflected in whatever laws and regulations are adopted. Related to that is this provision that if our ethical responsibilities conflict with law or any policy, our first commitment should be to the code of ethics, and we should always try to resolve any conflicts in a responsible manner, but again, keeping the code of ethics at the forefront. So kind of turning that around, I think it therefore stands to reason that when we have a say, when we're writing, creating laws and regulations, it behooves us to make sure that they're as consistent with our code of ethics as possible, because that will minimize conflicts down the road. Of course, we also have a principal responsibility to clients and to operate in the best interest of clients. Foremost among the sub-items of that provision is this one, that clients have the right to effective treatment, and we behavior analysts have the obligation to advocate for and educate folks about scientifically supported, most effective treatment procedures. And some further information there, those are procedures that have both long-term and short-term benefits to clients and society. That's a very broad but very powerful and important ethical standard. It's one that I think sets us apart to some extent from other professions. Where this comes into play in this whole business of laws and regulations that govern our practice, in my opinion, is that this standard makes it necessary for us to do our best to see that the laws that say who can practice behavior analysis actually have training in the treatment procedures. Now, there's no professional credential that's going to guarantee that everybody who holds the credential is competent. Certainly doesn't guarantee that they're experts, doesn't guarantee that their treatments are going to be universally effective. But at the minimum, we want to assure that the people who are sanctioned by our governments to practice something called behavior analysis have some verified, documented amount of didactic training and supervised experiential training in these treatment procedures and have been tested, examined in the content. We have provisions in the compliance code about public statements that are made about behavior analysis that we make and that others make. And again, our obligation is to uphold our ethical standards in public statements, including, again, statements made by other people, where laws and regulations are statements about our profession. Very important. I mean, there are rules, again, that govern how ABA is practiced and who can practice it and who can call themselves behavior analysts. So again, I interpret this provision to mean that those of us who are working on crafting laws and regulations want to make sure that those statements accurately reflect our science, our profession, our best practices, and our ethical standards. The second one is related to that. And it will happen if you pursue laws and regulations governing your practice in New Jersey, that a lot of different people may get involved in influencing the content of the laws and regulations. And they won't all be behavior analysts, and they may either naively or purposefully introduce information, language that is not accurate, that's not correct. And so we have to be vigilant and do everything we can to see that the language of these laws and rules are correctly reflect our science and our practice. So given all that as a framework, APBA's position, you might not be surprised to know, is that everybody involved, all the stakeholders, the consumers, those who pay for services, governments, and members of the profession are protected best when the standards for obtaining and keeping credentials are uniform. So they're the same, they're applied the same across jurisdictions, across individuals. They are objective. They're not based on the opinions of a few people. They're verifiable, so we can independently determine if someone has had specified training or has passed an exam. And again, they can be defended in court if need be. We also think it's important to have laws and regulations specify that the practice of ABA will be regulated by members of the profession as well as consumers, rather than members of other professions. And those of you who were on the first webinar already have heard some of my arguments about that. I am going to just go ahead and reiterate, though, the rest of our position and the sort of core requirements for licensure that we advocate. We would like to see behavior analyst licensure laws and the rules or regulations for implementing those laws be based on the BACB standards, meaning that the main qualification for obtaining and maintaining a government-issued credential, such as a license, is current BACB certification. We also advocate for incorporating the compliance code, the supervision requirements, continuing education requirements, and other BACB standards into these state licensure laws to the greatest extent possible, and I'll explain why. Again, we also advocate for there being a licensing board or regulatory entity within each jurisdiction that is composed mainly of professional behavior analysts who understand the practice, because they're the ones who are going to be overseeing the practice of those who receive the state-issued credentials. The reason we take this position, making BACB certification the main requirement for a government state-issued credential, is that the competencies for practicing behavior analysis, that is the knowledge, skills, and abilities listed in the current BACB task list, and the content of the certification exams have all come from job analysis studies that the BACB has been conducting over these past 20 years. These are rigorous studies. They're not behavior analysis studies per se, but again, there are standards in the world of professional credentialing for doing these kinds of studies properly. The procedures usually consist of bringing together subject matter expert panels, 1, 2, 3, there may be several subject matter expert panels that are brought together, and in the early stages and throughout the process, really, they will just sort of brainstorm and come up with lists of the competencies, knowledge, and skills that are involved in practicing the profession. An expert psychometrician then takes that information and develops it into a very particular kind of survey that is then sent out to thousands of people practicing the profession. So many of you by now have probably responded to at least one of the BACB's job analysis surveys. And so you remember that you're asked to rate the importance of every single skill for BCBAs, for BCABAs, and perhaps for RBTs. The psychometrician then collates all those data, analyzes them, and again applies well-established standards for deciding which of those competencies are going to stay on the list and are going to determine the content of the certification exams, and which ones are not. And those studies have to be repeated every few years because obviously the science progresses, societal norms and standards change, laws and regulations change, and so the job analysis studies must be repeated. I already mentioned that the psychometric standards. There also are these standards from case law on professional credentialing that come into play when job analysis studies are conducted and requirements are derived. So the requirements for obtaining BACB credentials absolutely parallel the requirements for most professional licenses, most valid, legitimate, respected professions. That is, they include a degree or degrees, specific coursework in behavior analysis, specific experiential training, supervised training in ABA. Again, very importantly, passing a sound professional exam. And then, of course, after one obtains the credential, there's the requirement to comply with the ethical code and to obtain continuing education. Additionally, the BACB credentialing programs are accredited by something called the National Commission Council for Certifying Agencies of the Institute for Credentialing Excellence, which is a big mouthful, but the thing to know here is that the NCCA has very rigorous standards and systematic procedures that an entity has to follow to obtain their accreditation. That is, the entity, the BACB, has to comply with these overarching standards and rules in everything it does, how it determines eligibility requirements, how it develops and administers the exams, its disciplinary standards, and all of that. There's a lot of value in this fact that the BACB credentialing programs are accredited by the NCCA. And by the way, the NCCA is one of two entities in the United States that accredit professional credentialing programs. The other one is the American National Standards Institute. In both cases, accreditation is obviously very important and again carries value for practitioners and consumers and governments. Again, it means that the standards for obtaining and maintaining the credential have come from the profession, from people who are out there engaged in the practice, for example, and who should have intimate knowledge as to what is involved in that practice. I think this is really important because of the accreditation requirements, the standards. The requirements for obtaining credentials can't be changed by any small group of people on the basis of some whim, some transient political, social, or financial pressures. As I semi-jokingly have said to people when I was on the BACB, it wasn't the case that we all sat around in Jerry Shook's recreation room over beers deciding to change the requirements. We had to follow all the procedures that I just described. It means that our credentialing standards have a very solid legal and empirical foundation. Again, they're based on the results of the data from those many job analysis studies. I find in working with regulators around the country that when we explain this, in some cases, all we have to say is the BACB credentialing programs are accredited by NCCA, and they nod and smile because they understand the value of that accreditation. The NCCA accredits a number of different professional credentialing programs, and all of them are widely respected and written into many laws, by the way. Making BACB certification the main requirement for licensure helps us with that reciprocity problem. It helps us to ensure to the extent possible that licensure requirements are pretty similar from one state or province to another, and that the way AB is practiced is pretty similar. Now, there, again, are always going to be some variations from one location to the other. It simplifies the development of the licensure law and the rules. It assures that people who obtain the state license, if that's the form of regulation the government adopts, are regulated by both the BACB and that state licensing board or other regulatory entity. So that gives us a double layer of protection for both consumers and professionals. Very importantly, making BACB certification the main requirement for licensure minimizes cost. A lot of the costs in operating many licensing boards come from the fact that those boards have to vet every single applicant for licensure. They have to check to see that they have completed the courses and degrees that the profession deems necessary. They have to make sure they don't have any disciplinary matters pending, and they often determine if that applicant can qualify to take a national exam. That's all very labor intensive. In our model of licensure, all of that, or most of it, is handled by the BACB. For someone to be BACB certified, they have to have already had their degrees and coursework and supervised training vetted and verified by the BACB, and they will have already passed the only psychometrically legally validated national exam in the practice of behavior analysis that is available. The BACB also coordinates with state licensing boards and other regulatory entities on disciplinary matters, and that can make things more efficient and cost efficient for the state. This is important because for states, licensure tends to be a big deal. Setting up a new licensure program for a new profession, which in our case may be a fairly small one to begin with, it is something that some states may not want to spend money on. So we have to carefully and clearly make the argument that we can show them how to do that in a way that won't be very costly for the state and that will in fact provide consumer protection. You will hear, and if you do pursue some kind of state regulation there in New Jersey, arguments that we should allow people who are not BACB certified to be licensed to practice behavior analysis. So I just want to run through some of our counter arguments to those contentions. For people who are not BACB certified, somebody is going to have to come up with some criteria, some standards for sanctioning those people to practice behavior analysis and for overseeing their practice that could be defended in court. Now, again, with the BACB, those have come from those many job analysis studies and from our profession over a long period of time. For people who aren't BACB certified, those kinds of decisions are going to fall on a small number of people, such as the members of the licensing board. Remember that the BACB compliance code isn't going to apply to people who aren't certified by the BACB. So the state's going to have to somehow generate a code of conduct for these non-certified people if they do decide to issue them a license. If that happens, it may mean that you have folks call themselves licensed behavior analysts. They're out there using and recommending interventions that don't really have the defining features of behavior analysis, but are going to be characterized as ABA. This confuses and misleads consumers and people who pay for ABA services, people who want to employ behavior analysts, and the general public with regard to who has and has not met these standards for practicing ABA that have come from the profession itself. It confuses people about the very nature of behavior analysis and certainly about what is and is not an actual ABA intervention. I think this puts consumers at risk. So again, you're going to have two categories of people, one who've met these standards and have passed a national exam, another group that has not. Consumers probably won't know the difference, and they may well be receiving services from folks who have questionable training in behavior analysis. Setting up these kinds of alternative licensing criteria also, frankly, is just completely in conflict with standards and professional credentialing and best practices, as well as the ethical standards of our field. And I would argue that if we allow these alternative pathways to state licensure and behavior analysis, we're ultimately undermining the integrity of our science and of the profession. So just to wrap up, I would encourage you, as you consider whether to pursue some kind of state regulation there in New Jersey, to work to incorporate the BACB standards into whatever laws and rules may be adopted, whether it's licensure or some other type of law. Again, because the standards for BACB credentialing have come from our profession, simplifies procedures for everyone. If we simply make BACB certification the main requirement, that is really the vision that Jerry Shook and others had when they started the BACB, that it would eventually serve as the foundation for state licensure. It also helps to prevent confusion among behavior analysts. If you had one set of requirements for your state license and a different one for your international certification, that would obviously be confusing and can be very cumbersome. So it's just better all the way around if the requirements are consistent. And again, it ensures that your state standards for who can be licensed and who can practice behavior analysis are going to be consistent with our international standards, that is, the BACB requirements, over time as those are updated with each new job analysis study that the BACB conducts. And I'll stop there and take questions.
Gina, hi. This is Eric.
Hey, Eric.
Thank you. Nice, well done. We currently, so to everyone, we are taking questions. I don't currently have any on the board. We can wait a minute or so to see if any pop up. If you don't have any questions to submit now, just a suggestion, we have an email address at the NJABA site. It's governmentaffairs@njaba.org. So if you have questions later, or if there's something that comes up, you can send it over there and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Just a reminder too that as Suzanne said, this webinar qualifies for type 3, not type 2 CEUs, and you can find more information about that on the BACB website. And then just, we'll be updating the njaba.org webpage with updates about licensure specific to New Jersey and the process. So please check in to that website over the next couple of weeks and we'll have updates there. So just waiting. I don't think we have any questions, Gina. So obviously you covered everything very clearly. Oh, we got a couple. Hold on.
Hooray. I think it couldn't be 100% clear, and there must be. All
right. So I got one here. It says, my question is towards international immigrants that are here for a brief period of time and want to do one. Okay. What do we do? Recommend family when they return? If there's no certified BCBAs in their immediate area of living. I'm not sure. It's not written completely clearly there, but I think
it's a question whether
it sounds like somebody's getting service here. They're getting services here, and what do they recommend if they return back to their country and they don't have access to services by a certified BCBA? So a little bit different than the licensure question, but maybe you have some recommendations.
All I can really suggest there is that, or can offer, is that although behavior analysis is still trying to get a foothold in many parts of the world, it is growing internationally. The BACB has a person who is responsible entirely for international development and really travels all over the globe, working with universities to start offering coursework in behavior analysis and encouraging people in those countries to get training and then to go ahead and get BACB certification. So depending on the country, there may be quite a bit available in training and experience that will meet BACB certification requirements, or there may not be very much. On the BACB website, there is a searchable directory of all BACB certified people. You can go there and search by country and see if there are in fact any certified folks in your country at present. If not, then starting to talk to universities and government about setting things in motion to get people trained in this profession would be a good thing. Just as one example, I think it's a little bit of an outlier, but it's a great example. In the Czech Republic last year, a mom of a child with autism, she happens to be trained as a physician, but she had learned about applied behavior analysis. She had to bring people in from elsewhere to provide ABA services for her child. She looked at the research literature on the effectiveness of ABA services, and she went directly to the government of her country and said, we should be doing this here. And so they have, I think, recognized the profession and the BACB credentials as qualifications there. And again, things are at least starting to get set in motion for the universities in the Czech Republic to offer training. Other things can be done, arrangements can be made, for example, to raise money to have people within the country go to a country where there is training, or take coursework online, and bring in other people to provide training and supervision.
Great, thank you, Gina. Next question is just sort of a general question. We've gotten a few of these from the last webinar and even via the government affairs email. It's just basically, are we moving forward with state licensure in New Jersey? And I know we can comment that this is part of the process of actively exploring the movement towards licensure. And I don't know, Gina, if you wanted to maybe just touch on your experiences with some states and what that process looks like, and that sort of thing, to maybe give the folks just sort of an overview of that.
Sure. Well, New Jersey ABA is doing what we recommend that every state organization do, and that is to really carefully evaluate the circumstances in your state. That has to do with everything from the numbers of people who might qualify if you should pursue licensure, the political climate, if you initiate licensure, what's the likelihood that that bill is going to be adopted and signed by your governor. Economics, financial issues often come into play. Is there funding for ABA services? Are people who obtain the license likely to be able to have jobs and careers in your state? And if you are seriously considering filing a licensure bill, there also needs to be consideration of who's likely to oppose it. On what basis are they likely to oppose it? How do you prepare to head off or counter that kind of opposition? And that's where we can help APBA. We've got, again, a lot of experience working on these bills and laws around the country. So we've accumulated a lot of information about the typical opposition. And I think we have some pretty good arguments and resources for countering those. You also want to have your allies lined up. You want to make sure that you have people who will support your licensure bill, and not just by, saying, yeah, we think that's a good idea, but actively support it by writing legislators, by calling legislators, by showing up at hearings and meetings, and providing written and or oral testimony in support of the bill. So those are among the considerations. The process is always uncertain. You know, any bill that gets filed, it's going to have to go through a number of committees, and you just never know what's going to happen. There will be more than likely pressures to change the language, to amend the bill. You have to be prepared to, you know, be seen as willing to listen to those suggestions and to compromise to some extent, but you also have to be prepared to draw a line and say, yep, we might consider some changes, but there's a point beyond which we will not go, because if we were to amend the bill in certain ways, it might just gut it. It would completely undermine, you know, the objectives of seeking licensure to begin with. So you never know what's going to happen in the legislative process. It helps a lot, I think, if the state organization has a lobbyist, a good lobbyist, for example, has relationships already with legislators and with key players within state agencies. We've seen licensure bills pass in circumstances where much of that was not in place. That usually occurred because some powerful politician decided that people practicing behavior analysis in their state had to be licensed. But in general, it does take, again, the concerted effort of the state organization as well as a lot of its allies, consumer groups, again, legislative folks, legislative staff, state agency officials that are supportive, and so on.
Great. No, I think that was a great overview of the process and sort of what to look for. And just to add there too, NJABA has formed sort of a core committee that is doing the sort of exploration into licensure. And again, there'll be more information released onto the website as this process moves forward. And again, if you have questions about the licensure process, feel free to email us at governmentaffairs@njaba.org. And I don't have any others coming through right now.
Okay.
So I want to just thank Gina Green for her time again, and then thank everyone for participating. And again, any questions, shoot them over to us. And we will also, just FYI, there'll be more information too. We'll be holding information sessions throughout the state, actually 3, one in the north, central, and south over the next month. So again, look for that on njaba.org, and you can come out and get additional information about the licensure process. So.
And I want to thank NJABA and thank all of you. I think, you know, this is great participation in both of these webinars. I think that's indicative of the interest and engagement and commitment by people in New Jersey. And I look forward to working with you further if you do decide to pursue licensure.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for all your time, Gina.
Certainly.
Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.